Story 1. Little Nika. The Stormy Night. When I was 10 years old, my Aunt Sonia would often tell me old stories. It usually happened during storms when the wind howled through the trees, lightning lit up the room, and the lights in the house flickered as if trembling from the cold. One story stood out to me the most. At first glance, it seemed like just a family legend, but as I grew older, I realized there was something darker and more terrifying lurking beneath its surface. "I was just a girl when the war came to our town," Aunt Sonia would always begin. She would gaze into the distance, her voice heavy with a mixture of sadness and fear. She lived in a small suburb where everyone knew each other. The air was thick with anxiety as factories churned day and night to support the war effort. Every week brought news of deaths from the front lines, shattering families and leaving the entire neighborhood in mourning. At that time, my aunt was only a teenager. She worked as a nanny for a nearby family. The mother, Irina, was employed at a munitions factory, while the father, Anton, served at the front. Their little girl, Nika, was just 5 years old. She was a radiant child with a smile so bright it could chase away even the darkest shadows. But everything changed one bitterly cold day. The first sign. That morning, my aunt arrived at their house, expecting the usual scene, Nika running to her, laughing and full of excitement. But instead, she found the girl sitting in the corner of the living room, her back turned to the door. When Nika turned around, her eyes seemed unnaturally dark, her expression cold and unfamiliar. Instead of greeting my aunt with her usual giggles, Nika let out a piercing scream. "The light is too bright! My dress is too tight!" she shrieked, tugging at the fabric of her clothes. No matter what Aunt Sonia did, she couldn't calm her down. When Irina came home that evening, she looked as though she had aged 10 years in a single day. She had just received the devastating news that her brother had been killed on the front lines. What disturbed Aunt Sonia the most, though, was that Nika's outburst happened at the exact moment Irina received the telegram with the terrible news. And that was only the beginning. Terrifying changes. Over the following days, Nika's behavior grew more and more disturbing. She began to say things no child her age could possibly know, detailed descriptions of battles, bombed-out villages, and dying soldiers. Sometimes her voice would drop to a guttural, almost inhuman tone. Her eyes would roll back into her head, leaving only the whites visible. Each time there was news of casualties or another battle, Nika would have one of these episodes. It was as if she was somehow connected to the horrors of the war. Neighbors began whispering about possession. Some said the child was cursed, while others avoided the family entirely. One afternoon, while Aunt Sonia was watching Nika, she heard music coming from the girl's room. She cautiously entered to find Nika sitting at the family piano. Her small hands were playing a complex melody, a song no one had taught her. Her voice, deep and foreign, began to sing in what sounded like Latin. Nika's unblinking eyes locked onto Aunt Sonia as she played, and a chilling smile spread across her face. The bloody night. The breaking point came one stormy night. My aunt was sitting in the living room when she heard the stairs creak. Looking up, she saw Nika standing at the top of the staircase. In her hand, she held a razor blade. Step by step, the girl descended, leaving bloody footprints on the wooden stairs. Her feet were sliced open, skin and muscle hanging in strips. But Nika didn't seem to feel any pain. When she reached the bottom, she began singing the same haunting melody she had played on the piano. Her voice grew louder and louder until it felt like the very walls of the house would crack. Irina rushed Nika to the hospital, leaving Aunt Sonia to clean up the blood. But when she entered the bathroom to gather supplies, she froze in horror. On the floor, Nika had arranged pieces of her skin and muscle into a grotesque mosaic. At the hospital, the girl remained unresponsive. Priests and doctors were called, but nothing seemed to help. It wasn't until Irina received news that her husband, Anton, had been found alive that Nika finally stirred. She woke up as if nothing had happened. The disappearance life returned to some semblance of normalcy after that, but Nika was never the same. She became quiet, withdrawn, and eerily observant. People claimed she could predict deaths and accidents with unsettling accuracy. The last time Aunt Sonia saw her was years later, sitting on the steps of the town church. "Do you dream?" Nika asked. Her pale face turned toward my aunt. Before Aunt Sonia could answer, the girl stood, dusted off her dress, and walked away, disappearing into the foggy night. Some time later, Irina found Nika's room empty. The window was wide open, curtains billowing in the wind. Despite a frantic search of the town and surrounding woods, Nika was never seen again. Some said she had run away. Others whispered that something darker had taken her. Even years later, on stormy nights, my aunt would sit by the window and gaze into the darkness, her voice trembling as she whispered, "She's still out there, waiting, watching, smiling like something else is living inside her." Story number 2. The Whisper in the Dark. The First Encounter. I live in a quiet little town in the heart of England, surrounded by rolling hills and fields that stretch endlessly into the horizon. It's the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happens. A postcard-perfect village with cobblestone streets, tidy gardens, and a pub where everyone knows your name. But last week, my ordinary life took a terrifying turn. It began on a Tuesday night. My routine was as predictable as ever. I had dinner, mindlessly scrolled through my phone, and took a nap before jumping online to game with my friends. By midnight, I was thoroughly exhausted and ready to sleep. As I lay in bed, setting my alarms for the next day, a strange unease crept over me. It felt as if someone was watching me. The sensation was so strong that I found myself glancing toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but a small gap between them seemed to radiate darkness, a heavy, oppressive void. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to get up and yank the curtains open. There was nothing outside but the night sky and the faint outline of distant fields. I told myself I was being ridiculous, blaming the feeling on fatigue, and went back to bed. But something woke me up. At first, I thought it was the sound of the wind, but then I heard it. My name, whispered softly but insistently. "Ma Artin." I froze. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tiptoed through the house, checking every room. Everyone else was asleep. Before I realized what I was doing, I found myself stepping outside. Barefoot, on the cold pavement, I walked down my street. The road felt unnaturally long, stretching out before me in a way that didn't make sense. The houses on either side appeared warped, their windows dark and hollow, like lifeless eyes. When I finally reached the end of the street, I was standing in front of Springfield Asylum, an old abandoned building that had always intrigued me. But now, it felt alive. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe. As I approached the crumbling front door, I heard it again. My name, screamed this time, loud and guttural. Just as my hand touched the rusted doorknob, my alarm went off, jolting me awake in my bed. The second dream. I tried to brush off the dream as a side effect of stress, or maybe too much late-night gaming. But the next night, the unease returned. I climbed into bed, but the sense of being watched was stronger this time, suffocating. My body felt paralyzed, as if something was holding me down. Then came the voice again. "Help me! Please help me!" it begged. It sounded desperate, as though it was in unbearable pain. My eyes darted toward the window. A long, grating sound like nails dragging across glass filled the room. "Won't you let me in?" the voice asked, growing louder and more insistent. Fighting against the invisible weight pinning me, I managed to move my arm just enough to pull back the curtain. As soon as I did, the voice erupted into laughter, sharp, mocking, and inhuman. The glass in the window vibrated from the sound, and beyond it, the fields outside twisted and churned as if a storm was raging in the distance. I woke up drenched in sweat, the echo of that laughter ringing in my ears. A terrifying reality. By the third day, I couldn't ignore the dreams anymore. I needed to prove to myself that it was all in my head. So, in broad daylight, I decided to walk to Springfield Asylum. The day was unnervingly quiet. No birds sang and no cars passed me on the road. Even the air felt heavy, as if the world was holding its breath. As I approached the asylum, the familiar stench of rotting meat hit me, just like in my dreams. I froze when I heard it again. My name, faint and drawn out. The sound was coming from the shattered windows of the asylum. I stepped closer, my hands trembling. Looking inside, I saw them, two glowing green eyes burning like embers in the darkness. And then it rose. A figure, impossibly tall, unfolded itself from the shadows. Its skeletal frame was wrapped in decaying flesh, and its head was crowned with massive, gnarled antlers that scraped the doorway as it moved. Its face was a horrifying blend of a skull and stretched, rotting skin dripping with blackened saliva. It raised a twisted, claw-like hand and pointed directly at me. A cacophony of sounds erupted around me. Whispers, screams, cries for help. They overlapped, growing louder and louder until it felt like my skull would shatter. I bolted, sprinting away as fast as I could. The creature didn't follow, but its glowing eyes watched me, unblinking, as its laughter trailed after me like a dark tide. The asylum's secrets. Back home, I locked myself in my room, my heart racing. When I calmed down enough to think, I began researching the history of Springfield Asylum. What I found made my blood run cold. The asylum had been shut down decades ago after allegations of horrific experiments on patients. Stories of abuse, disappearances, and unexplained deaths surrounded the place. Local legends claimed that the spirits of those who had suffered there still lingered, their pain and anger manifesting in terrifying ways. Even now, as I write this, I feel its presence. Sometimes at night, I hear my name whispered outside my window, but I don't look. I'm too afraid of what I might see. Story number 3. The Schoolhouse Ghost. The plan. It was supposed to be a harmless prank. My best friend Dimitri and I had been planning it for weeks. The target? Our younger siblings. We wanted to scare them so badly they'd think twice about sneaking into our rooms or borrowing our stuff without asking. And we had the perfect location, the old schoolhouse on the edge of town. It was a place we'd visited a few times before, a crumbling, abandoned building hidden deep in the woods. Even during the day, the windows were grimy and clouded, casting shadows over the peeling walls and moldy floorboards. At night, it was downright terrifying. We spent days crafting the perfect ghost story to go along with the setting. A tale about vengeful spirits of children who had died there. Our plan was simple: lure our siblings to the schoolhouse under the guise of exploring, then scare them senseless with a few staged tricks. But things didn't go according to plan. The cemetery discovery. The day before the prank, Dimitri and I headed out to the schoolhouse to make sure it was still safe to use. The building itself hadn't changed much, still eerily silent, still reeking of mildew and decay. But as we explored the overgrown yard behind the schoolhouse, we stumbled across something we'd never seen before. Hidden among the tall weeds was a small cemetery. The headstones were old and weathered, their inscriptions barely legible. Most of the graves dated back to the 1800s, and what struck me most was that they all belonged to children. "Perfect," Dimitri said with a grin. "We'll tell them the schoolhouse is cursed by the spirits of these kids." I laughed along, but something about the cemetery unsettled me. The air felt colder there, heavier, as though we were intruding on something we had no business disturbing. The night of the prank. That night, we piled our siblings into Dimitri's car and drove out to the schoolhouse. On the way, we spun the story we'd crafted. Back in the 1800s, the schoolhouse burned down during a winter storm, Dmitri said. All the children were trapped inside, and they still haunt the place, looking for anyone foolish enough to wander in after dark. Our siblings, wide-eyed and clinging to each other, were already on edge by the time we arrived. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the schoolhouse. The trees surrounding the building loomed like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the night sky. We led them inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath our feet. As we walked through the darkened halls, we added more chilling details to our story, building the tension. But then I saw something. A shadow moved across one of the windows. It wasn't the flicker of a tree branch or the shifting of moonlight. It was deliberate, quick, and human-shaped. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Dmitri. He smirked, clearly thinking I was trying to spook him. But I wasn't. The ghostly woman. The air inside the schoolhouse was thick and stifling, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Dmitri's flashlight swept across the room, and that's when we both saw her. Thin, pale legs glided across the floor, visible for only a moment before vanishing into the shadows. She wore an old-fashioned dress, the fabric trailing behind her like mist. "What the hell was that?" Dmitri whispered, his voice shaking. I couldn't answer. The flashlight's beam trembled as Dmitri swept it across the room again, but the woman was gone. The man in the woods. We didn't stick around to figure out what we'd seen. Grabbing our siblings, we bolted for the exit. But as we stumbled out into the moonlit yard, we froze. The dummy we'd rigged earlier as part of the prank, it was supposed to be hanging from the schoolhouse doorway, a fake ghost, was gone. In its place stood a man. He was tall and unnervingly still, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes glinted in the moonlight, cold and unblinking. He started walking toward us. "Run!" I screamed. We darted into the woods, branches clawing at our clothes and faces. The man's footsteps followed, heavy and deliberate, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. The third child. In the chaos, I lost sight of my siblings. My heart pounded as I shouted their names, desperate to find them. Finally, I spotted them standing in a clearing, huddled together. But something was wrong. There were 3 of them. A third child had joined the group, a girl with pale skin, braided pigtails, and a dress that looked like it belonged in another century. She stood perfectly still, her arms hanging at her sides. Her hair didn't move in the breeze, and her eyes were unnervingly wide and glassy. "Who's that?" I asked, my voice trembling. My siblings stared at me, confused. "Who's who?" The girl turned her head toward me, a slow, mechanical motion. Before I could react, she shot upward, vanishing into the trees above us. The branches swayed, but there was no sign of her. The truth unveiled. When we finally made it back to the car, Dmitri broke the silence. "Okay," he said, his voice unsteady. "I need to tell you something." He confessed that he'd recruited a few of his friends to help with the prank. One was supposed to play the ghost in the schoolhouse, and another was supposed to be the man in the woods, but neither of them had brought the girl. To this day, I don't know who or what she was. Some nights, when I close my eyes, I can still see her blank, unblinking stare. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the faint creak of branches outside my window.